So yesterday, we were looking at Moses Mendelssohn, and to summarize, I think we could say that Mendelssohn's prescription, his strategy for Jewish flourishing, Jewish success in the modern world, was for the Jews to redefine their sense of themselves, their understanding of their tradition, their understanding of what Torah is, as a religion. A religion is a set of distinctive practices and beliefs, although Mendelssohn removes the belief element, having to do with the sacred. So there's something quite anti-political about a religion. Religion is a phenomenon that can exist in a nation state in a way that doesn't challenge the nation state with an alternative politics. Would Mendelssohn believe that religion should do what religions nowadays in democracies often do, which is criticize power? As they say in the United States from the civil rights movement, speak truth to power. Should religion have a prophetic role in addition to a kind of priestly role in the lives of individuals? I don't think Mendelssohn envisions that possibility. Religion is meant for the private education, edification, happiness, blessedness of individuals. It's not meant in any way to be a counterforce to the power of the state. Mendelssohn envisions the state as basically benevolent. It doesn't always act in benevolent ways, but its purpose is to help bring its citizens to happiness. So it governs best through education. We've seen all of this before. The point I'm just trying to underline here is that religion for him is this very private, spiritual phenomenon that's completely devoid of any political dimensions or implications. When one first reads Mendelssohn, one thinks, as an Enlightenment figure, he's very liberal. This is kind of a good presentation of what a religion should be doing in the modern world. It shouldn't excommunicate anyone, it has to be gentle and persuasive and compassionate toward all. It's very universalistic. But I think at the end of the day, Mendelssohn is very illiberal. There's something very perverse or ironic about his liberalism. And I'll just close the Mendelssohn part with this one observation. Mendelssohn is so focused on redefining religion as a private phenomenon, Judaism as a private phenomenon, that he not only argues that the Jewish community shouldn't be able to excommunicate anyone, he argues that the Jewish community or any Christian church should not be allowed to own property. They're so individual, they're so private, there's just a sort of gathering of people of the same mentality, that they should have no public kind of reality at all. To say that a church or synagogue or religious community is not a public institutional phenomenon and shouldn't even have the right to own property is a phenomenal rejection of religious liberty. I mean, it's actually an extremely illiberal or anti-liberal position. So I think Mendelssohn, in his eagerness for Jews to be accepted by the German state, to become equals, to become citizens, to have full rights, massively distorts the nature of Judaism by so suppressing its political dimension. Is Mendelssohn influential for subsequent generations? Yes, very much so. in the early 19th century, traditional Judaism begins to split. And gradually, there's a group of people who want to reform, who want to adapt, modernize, alter inherited Judaism, and make Judaism really into a religion that looks a lot more like Lutheranism. There'll be a Predigt sermon every week delivered in the German language. The presence of Jewish law will pretty much be brought way, 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 way down, and you really will just have a kind of worship much in the German language. It will be a religion in the Protestant sense. This is the Reform movement. It does not start out radical. It starts out with small adaptations, but it gradually comes to reject Jewish law, Jewish kind of communal, ethnic, national self-understanding altogether. I don't think Mendelssohn would have approved of that, but Mendelssohn helped put some of the intellectual pieces in place on which that movement built. Mendelssohn's own view is that Jewish law, at least the ritual parts of it, remains in force. Mendelssohn had, I think, 10 children. 8 of them converted to Christianity. So even within his own, I don't want to have an ad hominem argument against Mendelssohn, but even within his own family, the kind of synthesis he tried to hold together between becoming German, being accepted as German, and remaining fully observant religious Jews, that didn't last. And the Reform movement in the early 19th century is a kind of response to the fragility, the problematic quality of Mendelssohn's synthesis. So what we're going to get into now in the period around the First World War in the early 20th century are thinkers several generations after Mendelssohn who have a very different existential situation, sociological situation, intellectual situation with which they have to cope. The 19th century, following Mendelssohn, really tried to suppress the political self-understanding of the Jews, the national self-understanding, as much as they could. By the end of the 19th century, through anti-Semitism and pogroms in this part of the world, increasing anti-Semitism in Germany, this sense that the emancipation is not working. We fulfilled our end of the bargain. We engaged in Haskalah. But look, we're still being excluded even after 1871, when Jews become full German citizens across the entire Reich. Before that, it was patchy, some parts of the German Empire more than others. There was this sense that Jews are not just Germans who have a different religious confession, but Jews are Jews. They're a people. And it's in this atmosphere that the Zionist movement began to develop in the late 19th century. I mean, the Zionist movement in Eastern Europe and in Germany and Austria, Hungary, mostly a secular, not religious movement, but very much a political movement. That is, even among those who, like Achad Ha'am, who lived in Odessa, even among those who said we have to rebuild a modern Jewish culture before we can have a Jewish state, they still wanted a Jewish state. Theodor Herzl, he wanted a Jewish state. His book is called Der Judenstaat, the Jewish state. It's a political movement that says emancipation did not really work. It's taken our essence away from us. We have to get our political dimension back. And the way to do that in the modern world is to have something like a sovereign state or at least control under a territory within the context of another sovereign state. Palestine within the Ottoman Empire, let's say, or under the British Mandate after the First World War. So politics returns with a vengeance to the Jews. There's not a lot of thinking on the part of secular Zionists about how to reconcile that with Judaism. It's mostly either saying Judaism is irrelevant, we've grown beyond it, or Judaism is a culture with religious elements, we have to rebuild it in light of our modern sense of peoplehood and political nationhood that we hope for. So Franz Rosenzweig, an anti-Zionist, and Isaac Breuer, also an anti-Zionist, the two people we'll study today, are responding to this big, big change in Jewish history, in modern culture. I said both of our figures today are anti-Zionists, but in very different ways. Rosenzweig, like Mendelssohn, wants to say that Judaism does not have a political dimension. He is an anti-Zionist because he thinks that Jews live in some way beyond history. To go back into history and to have a state is dragging the Jews back toward an earlier stage of their experience. It's not their destiny. The Jewish destiny is to live in time, but outside of world history, cultivating a kind of eternal intimacy with God through prayer and liturgy. Rosenzweig has this fabulously metaphysical view of what Judaism is, and I'll explain this in some detail very soon. So he actually likes some things about the Zionist movement. He likes the fact that it represents a Jewish consciousness, a will to Jewish life, an alternative to assimilation. It requires greater education in what it is to be a Jew. And there are elements about it that he applauds. But to the extent that Zionism is a political pursuit of Jewish sovereign statehood, Rosenzweig sees that as not just a mistake, but a very dangerous kind of orientation. And he doesn't do that because, unlike his teacher Hermann Cohen, he doesn't do that because he's assimilated and is threatened by it, and it will threaten his standing as a German. He's totally critical of Germany and being Germans. His problem is not that it picks the Jews out as imperfect Germans. His problem is that Zionism misunderstands Judaism. So that's a complicated position, which I'll try to clarify. Isaac Breuer is also anti-Zionist, but for very different kinds of reasons. Isaac Breuer is one of the leaders of the Orthodox community in Germany. And from Breuer's point of view, God is working in history, and like Rav Kook in Palestine, he believes that there's something fundamentally right about the Zionist movement. God is using these secularists like Theodor Herzl to wake the Jews up and to begin to get the Jews to respond to history in a very new way. So Breuer finds something very important from a religious perspective in Zionism. The reason he rejects it, however, is because it's so secular, because it doesn't know that God is the one who's driving this awakening of the Jewish people forward. So what Breuer wants to do is to create an Orthodox alternative to Zionism, which will emphasize the political activity and activism that the Zionists are engaged in, but will do so explicitly under the banner of Torah. So for Breuer's kind of anti-Zionist but pro-political activism perspective, the goal is not, a European-style nation-state parked on the eastern shore of the Mediterranean, which Herzl gives us in the Jewish State novel. The Old New Land novel. What Breuer gives us is a vision of what he calls Medinat HaTorah. Medinat HaTorah. Which means what?
The state of Torah.
Yeah, or to make it sound more like English, Torah state. That is, Breuer wants there to be a Jewish state in the land of Israel. And he wants the constitution and the law of that state to be the Torah. And he thinks this can be done. That the Torah, because it's comprehensive, because it has these political constitutional elements in it, because under the rabbi's development, it has civil law and criminal law, and everything you need, the Torah can be made quite naturally, as Maimonides thought, to be the law of a kind of messianic future state. Except Breuer, as a modern, thinks you don't have to sit on your hands and wait for the Messiah to bring this about. And then you can have Maimonides' code as the law of the land. Breuer thinks that although the Zionists are confused, they don't know what they're working toward this ultimately, and the Orthodox shouldn't cooperate with the Zionists, but they should have their own parallel movement that is trying to bring about a Medinat HaTorah. So Breuer writes most of his books and pamphlets in German, but by the time he moves to Free State Palestine in, I think it's 1936, he starts writing in Hebrew, and we have a couple of books by Breuer in Hebrew that develop the idea of a Medinat HaTorah. So again, not a Zionist, but somebody with a highly political view, like Maimonides, of what Judaism really is and where it's going, a total repudiation of a kind of Mendelssohn view, in its own perverse way, a kind of Spinoza view, except without Spinoza's belief that Judaism proper and its law has come to an end.
There is a Breuer school in New York. Is it Breuer in Washington Heights?
Yes. So why is that? Let me just take 30 seconds to say something about that. There was in this is actually also relevant to Judaism and politics in the modern world. So when the reform movement that I had mentioned in Germany became institutionalized, started developing its own synagogues, its own rabbinical seminary, its own network from the 1840s on. In Germany, you had Jewish communities that were integrated. It wasn't like here or the United States where every group of Jews does their own thing and synagogues are independent of one another and it's all sort of local. In Germany, you had these, being Germany, you had this very top-down, bureaucratic kind of organization, and all of the institutions in the Jewish community were part of a formal structure called the community, Gemeinde. So schools, kosher butcher, mikveh, immersion pools, all the various synagogues, tzedakah, charity institutions. All of these things were part of a community. This was going back to the Middle Ages, except since Jews were expelled from much of Germany, it's not unbroken continuity, but they went back to the model. So in the average Jewish community, or Gemeinde, you had, under the roof of the Gemeinde, there were Reform and there were also Orthodox. In 1876, under Chancellor Bismarck, who was trying to weaken the Catholic Church, the so-called Kulturkampf, the culture struggle, Bismarck had a law passed which allowed groups to break away from Gemeinden, from their communal bodies, and be separate, independent. He thought this would, blow up the Catholic Church in Germany, which was a source of political opposition. Some Jews took advantage of this so-called Austrittsgesetz, this secession or separation law. And these Orthodox, some of them said, we're fine. Reformed Jews are our brothers and sisters. We can live in the same space with them as long as we have our own synagogues, our own kosher butchers and everything. But we'll pool our money together and we'll exist under one institutional roof. A group of Jews, primarily in Frankfurt, under the leadership of Breuer's grandfather, a man named Samson Raphael Hirsch, and a very influential Orthodox rabbi. The family came from, he's from Hamburg, Altena, up north. They said, this is impossible. The Reformed Jews are posh'im, they're sinners. And you don't participate in a community with sinners. Obviously, every community has sinners, but the sinners have to recognize that they're sinning and make tshuva and want to come back and be with, the Torah Troy, the Torah loyal Jews. This institutional arrangement bakes this in. That is, it stabilizes it. Reformed Jews are encouraged to continue sinning against the Torah, and Orthodox Jews have to accept it and swallow it. So in 1876, there was a group of separatist Orthodox who broke away. They shattered the community. They ended its historic unity, and they developed their own institutions. The Breuer family, after Hirsch died, the Breuer family came from Hungary, where they also had this kind of separatism. And the Breuer family, they led the so-called separatist Orthodox. Today we would call it Haredi. But Haredi with a difference, that is, they're university-educated people. But they were very resistant to this kind of liberalism or pluralism. Breuer's brother, Isaac Breuer, his brother Joseph, who came to Washington Heights, New York, fleeing the Nazis, in their so-called Frankfurt on the Hudson. So Yeshiva University in New York represents a kind of communal orthodoxy that was not so meshuggah, to use the technical term, as these guys. And when they renamed Yeshiva College, Breuer College, it was a big deal to make peace between the separatist Orthodox and the communal Orthodox. So in a way, what Hirsch and Breuer's began in 1876 was healed in Upper Manhattan, 30 years ago or whatever it was. So it's a long detour to answer your question, but it's not irrelevant to the whole political business. Sasha, you have a question?
Yeah, it doesn't actually concern the topic, but you repeated the word sinner.
And I was thinking about how the term sinner or to sin is different from the Christian understanding of the same term. And I suppose this is something very, very different.
Yeah, so I certainly would not call anyone here a sinner. It's not a word that I use a lot. I mean,
So
if I use it, it's
is it basically a criminal?
in Hebrew, the word that Breuer used in his writing. So there are several words, but from this root, he used the word pushim, and pesha. It really has a sense of rebellion.
Mm-hmm.
It's more of a politically loaded term. It's not like some.
So it's rather political than.
Yeah, it's already rather political.
Which is why I was asking.
So, I mean, when you think about it, one of the most solemn occasions of the Jewish year is on Yom Kippur, Arab Yom Kippur, the night before Yom Kippur begins, and there's that prayer. Well, it's not a prayer. I mean, it's a declaration, Kol Nidre, Kol Nidre, which is chanted, very moving. And what it is the members of the community who are conscious of their own sins throughout the year, saying that we consent to pray with other sinners. You know, we're all sinners here, so we have to somehow acknowledge that we're sinners, and it's all right for the sinners to pray together. So it's not that the Hirsch and other critics of this wanted to say, oh, those are sinners, we can't have anything to do with them. It's those are sinners, from their point of view, who don't acknowledge their sin, who are incapable of seeing where they go wrong. It's an ideology. Let's talk about Rosenzweig, who's also settles in Frankfurt and who actually wrote letters back and forth with Isaac Breuer. I don't know if they ever met each other face to face, but they lived in the same city at the end of Rosenzweig's life. Rosenzweig's dates are 1886 to 1929. He didn't live a very long life. Many people study modern Jewish philosophy would claim that Rosenzweig's big book, The Star of Redemption, is the most important work of modern Jewish philosophy. And I think there's much going for that claim. It's not my cup of tea exactly, but it's certainly a great work, albeit a very puzzling one. One of the scholars of Rosenzweig, my friend Michael Morgan at the University of Toronto, says that Rosenzweig wrote The Star of Redemption for 5 people, just as friends, people he was talking to. So when you read it, it's a weird book. It's hard to follow. It's not philosophy in any ordinary sense. It doesn't make arguments. It doesn't cite evidence. It's not what most people think of as philosophy. It's more like a kind of inspired expressionistic poetry. You can't just pick it up and read it. You have to... but I think much of what attracts people to Rosenzweig is not the profundity, the depth of his thought, which is genuine. His thought is exceedingly profound, but rather the story of his life. So that's worth dwelling on for a minute. From a pedagogical point of view, when I try to teach Rosenzweig, which normally I have, a couple of months to do, rather than 20 minutes or something. But you have to start with the story of Rosenzweig's life, because then students say, oh wow, what a heroic life, how exemplary. And then when they finally get to his writing, and they just want to say, they can't do that because his life is so compelling. So Rosenzweig's story was he was born into this upper middle class, very educated, very cultured, very assimilated German Jewish family in Hesse, in central Germany, in the city of Kassel. And Rosenzweig had all of the benefits of this sort of upper middle class upbringing, music, art, travel, very precocious young man. The family was aware that they were Jewish. They went to synagogue maybe 3 times a year. It didn't hamper or hold them back. They didn't experience dreadful anti-Semitism, but on the other hand, they also didn't care much for Judaism, like many Jews of that class. They saw it somewhat with affection, somewhat disdain, sort of like a difficult relative that you're sort of amused by, but don't want to spend too much time with either. Rosenzweig originally goes to the university to become a medical doctor. And he starts studying biology and medicine, but also literature and history and philosophy, and like other German students, you don't just go to one university, you go all over the place. So he's traveling from university to university. And he winds up in Freiburg in the southwestern part of Germany, in the Black Forest. And he decides that what really interests him is political philosophy. And he starts studying with one of the major German historians, intellectual historians of the early 20th century, a man named Friedrich Meinecke. And he writes a dissertation on the political philosophy of Hegel. It's ultimately published. It's a 2-volume book called Hegel and the State. So it's not that Rosenzweig is ignorant of the political dimension of human life, the role that political thought plays within a philosophical system. Rosenzweig is a sensitive young man who has a big intellectual problem. He's seems to be a happy individual. He's not gloomy, he's not Franz Kafka, but on the other hand, he has a deep worry that modernity has given him. And that is, how do we reconcile our experience as unique individual subjectivities, selves, who see the world through our own eyes, who understand ourselves to be unique, to be in time, having a flow of experience that's only real to us or for us because we're subjects. How do we reconcile that peculiarity that I exist in the world with the objectivity of the world? With the fact that the world is a world of things that are not like me, that are not subjects in the sense that I'm a subject. Even some of the things in the world are other human beings, and they're presumably subjects like I am. But we can't really know that. We can't experience what the world is through their eyes. We can only do it through our own eyes. So if I could put this in more 21st century language, I would say, what is it to be a person in a world of things? How far down does the first person sense of reality go? modern neuroscience would tell us it doesn't go very far. There's no such thing as a self. At the end of the day, we are brains with trillions of neuronal connections. Our brains are formed of complex molecules. Our molecules are formed ultimately of quantum fields. At the end of the day, it all boils down to things. There is no first-person perspective. That's a sort of psychological illusion produced by natural selection, produced by evolution. Rosenzweig doesn't use this language. This is my language. But this is the way, neuroscientists, Darwinian, neo-Darwinian biology, evolutionary psychology talks. The best you could say about our first-person perspective, our sense of selfhood, is that it's an adaptive device given to us by evolution. That's in a way Rosenzweig's problem. What is it to be a subject in an objective world? How can we reconcile objectivity and subjectivity? Rosenzweig, in addition, has modern worries. Is there any basis for values? What's good? What's right? What basis does the good, does the right have in an objective, physical, material universe? How does it get there? Have human beings put it there? Do human beings just create it and impose it, ethics, value, as Nietzsche, a very influential figure at this time, would have us believe? So Rosenzweig is looking for what he calls orientation. He's looking for some way of resolving his philosophical, personal, existential problems that haunt him. He's living in Leipzig, working on his Hegel book, his dissertation, and he becomes friendly with a contemporary who's teaching law at the University of Leipzig, a man named Eugen Rosenstock. Eugen Rosenstock, like so many other Jewish university professors, is a Christian. Rosenstock converted to Christianity, which was really necessary, with very few exceptions, in order to be a professor in Germany. Rosenzweig's closest friend, also a friend of Rosenstock, was his cousin, two cousins, Hans and Rudolf Ehrenberg. They both converted to Christianity. He was closer to Hans. One night, July 7th, 1913, Hans and Eugen and Franz stayed up all night, and those two men convinced Rosenzweig that the only way to live an authentic existence in the world was as a Christian. And Rosenzweig resolved on that night to become Christian. I'm not going to get into the exact argument that they used, but that was his strong personal decision. He went home to Kassel. He told his mother about this. Didn't have a good relationship with his father. His mother was very, very angry and kicked him out of the house. Rosenzweig also resolved, and this I think is the inspiring part, he said, I cannot become a Christian as a pagan. That is, I'm a Jew. I don't know anything about Judaism. I haven't really been raised with it, but if I'm going to become a Christian, I'm going to become a Christian as a Jew, as St. Paul and the other apostles did. So Rosenzweig begins to study Judaism. In October of that year, he goes to a small synagogue in Berlin. not the big assimilated Reform temple in Kassel that his parents went to 3 days a year, but he goes among Orthodox Jews, immigrants from Eastern Europe, and he has this experience of Yom Kippur with these non-German Jews, and he writes the next day to Ehrenberg that he's now come to understand that although it's true, as the New Testament says, that no one comes to the Father except through the Son, the Jews are already with the Father. And they don't need to come to him. They're already with him. And he says, for this reason, ich bleibe Judah. I remain a Jew. He then sets about really digging into what it means to be a Jew. And he starts studying with this great philosopher, really the only Jewish thought leader, as we'd say today, who taught at a German university as a full professor and did not become a Christian, Hermann Cohen, my favorite 20th century Jewish philosopher. And he starts, really trying to understand what Judaism is in a deep and philosophical way. And then there's the First World War. Rosenzweig is called up, and he goes to the Balkans, to Macedonia, and he is at a station on a mountaintop looking for enemy planes. So he spends most of the war there. There was a little combat, but not much. I mean, we're not, talking about being in a trench in France or something. And he starts writing a book on military postcards and mailing these postcards back to his mother. And this book is The Star of Redemption. So when you begin to read The Star of Redemption, it's sort of in these kind of small chunks. It's sort of built piece by piece by piece, and that's what he could get on these postcards. When the war is over, Rosenzweig is faced with a choice, and because of the excellence of his academic work on Hegel and the discovery that he made while researching Hegel's own manuscripts in the State Library in Berlin, he's offered a university job. He had the way open for him to become a professor of history. And he makes this important decision that he's not going to do that. And it's not like the world today. In Germany, a professor was an extremely meritorious kind of position that one could attain. It was very honoring. Rosenzweig turns it down, and he decides to start something that never really existed before in Frankfurt. He called it the Free Jewish House of Study, or the Frankfurt Lehrhaus. And what this Lehrhaus, this Beit Midrash, this house of Jewish learning or study was an experimental kind of Jewish educational institution for adults. The idea was anyone can come. You don't have to have any background in Hebrew, in Judaism, in anything. And it wasn't just if you had no background, you sat there and somebody lectured to you about, what the history or the meaning of the text is. Or something. It was completely participatory. It was all based on dialogue. Everyone had something to bring out of their own experience. And Breuer writes to Meinecke that he's going to start a Jewish adult education and not become a university professor. That's really astonishing that he would have made that choice. But in many ways, adult Jewish education all over the world since then was based on the Frankfurt Lehrhaus model. The scholars who helped to found the university that I went to, Brandeis, were German Jewish emigres fleeing Hitler who knew Franz Rosenzweig and who taught Jewish studies in the Frankfurt Lehrhaus. So that would be interesting enough, but Rosenzweig's life story gets even more interesting, although tragic. He begins to develop in 1923, just when the Lehrhaus is really getting started. He begins to develop some neurological problems. And the neurological problem turns out to be a terrible disease. In English, it's called ALS, or Lou Gehrig's disease. It's rather like Parkinson's. It's complete muscular paralysis. So within less than 2 years, Rosenzweig could not speak, he could not move, he couldn't do anything. He was as if made of wood, just sitting up in his bed until his wife, he got married until his wife put him down in the bed. He wrote many of his essays and his shorter book in this state of paralysis. How did that happen? Initially, before he was fully paralyzed, they made this typewriter for him with a keyboard of wooden, like wooden discs, and he was able to, that he should move his arm and be able to drop it, and be able to letter by letter. Then that stopped. And ultimately what he could do, the only movement that was left to him is he could blink an eye. So his wife would go over every letter on the keyboard, and when he blinked his eye, she'd pick out that letter. You'd think under these circumstances that his many articles and essays would read like, text messages, just very brief. But he is an extremely literary writer. His German is very challenging. He didn't stop his kind of style. He's very witty, he's sometimes very funny, very ironic. He uses very rich literary references from the whole Western tradition in classical languages. It's very complex but very lively writing at the same time, and much of it was done in a state of this 99.9% paralysis. He also wrote hundreds of letters. We have his letters. Have all been published. They haven't all been translated. And then he dies in 1929, before his world really goes completely to hell. So that's, I think, part of what people find inspiring about his life, and what draws many modern Jews and others to the study of Rosenzweig. Let me then actually get to his thesis. Maybe that we're going to have to continue some of this on Monday. Okay, so there's a little selection from the last book of the Star of Redemption. That's your reading. There's a selection that starts People and State. Do you have that? Yeah, the Holy War I and World Peace are also relevant, but maybe we'll just do People and State. Let me just kind of broadly give you Rosenzweig's view, and then we'll see how this exemplifies it. So, Rosenzweig is a scholar of the kind of philosophical movement in 19th century Germany that's called idealism. The greatest of the German idealists was Hegel, but there are others, Fichte, Schelling. It was a movement. The problem of idealism, broadly speaking, is this idea that originally there's this kind of whole, there's this totality. Reality has an unbroken, holistic integrity to it. But manyness comes out of oneness. There's this so-called principium individuationis. Somehow individuality, personal subjectivity, emerges from das All, from the whole, from the all. How does this happen? For the idealists, the integrity of the world, its wholeness, its fullness, is original. Everything is shattered, everything is broken. Someone like Hegel, history is the story of re-synthesizing, recreating the original whole. And the movement through time that constitutes human history is a movement of spirit, of the animating principle of reality toward reconciliation with itself. You know, the famous thesis, antithesis, synthesis that forms a thesis. Rosenzweig's view is partly coming out of this, but his view is that there is no original wholeness. There's not some sort of lost paradise of reality that has to be regained through a process of history and time. Reality starts out divided into three elements that are given. He calls the elements man, world, and God. So there's human subjectivity. There's every individual's sense of their own individuality, not reducible to anything else. We aren't just our brains. There's the objectivity of the world, the givenness of things. And for Rosenzweig, there's God. But for him, God is not yet God until God enters into relations with man and with world. Rosenzweig gives us a system of philosophy in the Star of Redemption that tries, like Hegel, to understand the course of history through reflection on what it is to be a self in the world that is open to the love of God. So his story in the Star it shouldn't be thought of as a sort of narrative about how the world came into being or anything like that. It's a reflection from the point of view of an individual subjectivity on what it is to be human in a world that ultimately becomes world, human being becomes human being, God becomes God through mutual relations. It would take, I think, much longer to try to make this as clear as one would like, and I have. But this kind of broad story about coming to the end where everything becomes all in all, as he puts it. He thinks of in Jewish theological categories. There's creation, there's revelation, and there's redemption. Creation is not creation as we might think of it in a conventional theological way, as there's nothing, there's something, and the something gets there because God brings it out of nothing. He's not interested in that kind of language. For him, creation is a pre-existing God enters into a relation with a pre-existing world. God, he thinks, comes out of what he calls nothing. The world comes out of nothing, and the two affirm each other. There's a relationship there. Revelation is man, or individual human consciousness, coming into relation with God through the experience of love, through feeling grounded and oriented in reality, no longer lost, alienated, redemption is God, is human beings, man, as he puts it, coming into full relation with the world, overcoming objectivity, subjectivity, division. Now, to get more relevant, there are two ways that human beings live in the world, two authentic ways. And through the course of history, until the ultimate redemption, there are these two ways that are complementary. God and world need human beings to be in this complementary but mutually antagonistic relationship. And those two ways for human beings are Judaism and Christianity. It says that God has put enmity, antagonism between Jews and Christians, but from a higher point of view, both of these ways are necessary. And these two ways are what drive history forward toward this eschatology, toward this ultimate redemption. They're very different. There's a division of labor. The Jews started out as a people who knew war, who had armies, who had kings, who conquered a land, who fought wars. The Jews were a normal people, so to speak. But all of that was taken away from the Jews. They were conquered, they were scattered, and all that remained to the Jews was their own unique way of life, which comes from revelation. And what the Jews have achieved is a kind of meta-history, is the term he uses. That is, they live in time, but they are above time at the same time. The Jews find eternity within themselves. For the non-Jewish world, there's this constant struggle to achieve eternity, permanence. And that struggle is always a matter of trying to conquer more territory, of trying to sink deep roots in the soil, of having states and laws that they work hard to preserve so that their own civilizations will endure. For Rosenzweig, history obliterates all of that. None of that can be permanent. The only permanent thing are the Jews. They are as Hebrew puts it, an Am Olam, an eternal people. The Jews are not a religion, in a sense. A religion is some set of beliefs and practices that you come to endorse. Rosenzweig uses, frankly, racial language. It's hard to accept after Hitler. But Rosenzweig talks about the eternity of the Jews as guaranteed biologically by their own blood. Rather striking. He's drawing this from his favorite Jewish philosopher, Yehuda Halevi, in the Middle Ages. So the Jews are in time, but they're not in history in a sense. They don't struggle. They're beyond war. They may be the victims of war, but they don't make war. For him, this is what it is to be holy. A holy people is not a people that can perish. Hebrew is a holy language, from his point of view, precisely because it's not the language of every day. That's wrong. It became the language of every day. Rosenzweig turns out to be wrong in every category from an empirical point of view. The Jews come to have a state, they engage in war, Hebrew becomes an everyday language. Just wrong up and down the line. But we're dealing with this very, very powerful theological, metaphysical vision. And so what do the Christians do? The Jews have learned how to discover eternity in time through a kind of endless circle of the Jewish year, of having the holidays. He writes very eloquently, movingly, understanding each of the Jewish festivals, the Sabbath. This is a way of experiencing eternity and time. Christians are, in a way like this. Christianity brings an eternal message, but Christianity wrestles within the soul of each individual nation for supremacy. So he talks about the German soul as the place where Siegfried, the pagan Teutonic hero, of myth, and Christ, are struggling with each other. He sees Christianity as the peoples who make up the Christian world is very much embedded in history. And the purpose of the Christian struggle is to bring this universal saving love of God into this bloody history and have Christianity vanquish paganism. And the model for where Christianity is going is Judaism, in the sense that Jews are reconciled to time by living outside of actual human history in their own little biological, liturgical, eternal utopia. So the Jews don't worry about the world. They're not involved in it. They shouldn't want to have a state, because that drags them back into the world in the biggest way possible. Leave that to the nations. Christians have to fight their way through history to take that kind of eternity of intimacy with God that the Jews know and make it actual in the world. So in order to have ultimate redemption, you need Christianity. This is a very powerful statement from a Jewish thinker about the divinity of Christianity. How Christianity, as Christians understand it more or less, is part of God's plan. And Rosenzweig is a sort of major figure for the higher reaches of theological dialogue between Jews and Christians in the late 20th century and today. In fact, when full redemption comes in the future, when God is all in all, there won't be Judaism or Christianity, because they'll be all in all. There won't be any more divisions. Well, you might say, what does this do to Buddhists? What does this do to Hindus? What's that all about? Is there any validity there? Rosenzweig treats those understandings of what it is to be human in the first book of the Star, where it deals with creation. That is, these, as far as he sees it, are partial understandings of what it is to be human in the world that have not yet experienced revelation. So it's not like they're sinful or bad or wrong. He thinks that they represent perspectives on the world which just haven't sort of moved to the next stage of relationship between God and man. So he's kind of Hegelian in that. He sees, I think notoriously, he sees Islam as a counterfeit religion. He's rather hostile toward Islam in a way that he's not hostile toward paganism and toward the Eastern traditions. Okay, so very briefly, let's look at, from the last book of the Star of Redemption, People and State. The Jewish people has already reached the goal toward which the nations are moving. It has that inner unity of faith and life, which while Augustine may ascribe it to the Church in the form of the unity between fides and salus, faith and salvation, is still no more than a dream to the nations within the Church. Here's the critical part. But just because it has that unity, the Jewish people is bound to be outside the world that does not yet have it. Though living in a state of eternal peace, it is outside of time, agitated by wars. Insofar as it has reached the goal which it anticipates in hope, it cannot belong to the procession of those who approach this goal through the work of centuries. Its soul, replete with the vistas afforded by hope, grows numb to the concerns, the doing, and the struggling of the world. The consecration poured over it as over a priestly people renders its life unproductive. Unproductive is one of the taunts, the accusations of anti-Semites. The Jews are not productive, they're not farmers. You know, they don't grow anything, they don't make anything. They're always in finance, journalism, education. They don't do anything real. You know, they don't bring value to the world. They're just critics who hang around on the outside and cause trouble. That's a typical anti-Semitic trope. So he's playing off that. I mean, he's not disputing it. He's saying that Jews are kind of force above ordinary society that doesn't really care to join in. Its holiness hinders it from devoting its soul to a still unhallowed world, no matter how much the body may be bound up with it. So Jews don't want to participate in society. A more liberal Jewish thinker, like his contemporary Leo Beck, or Abraham Joshua Heschel, who taught at the Lehrhaus before he came to the United States, they see Judaism primarily as a force for making the world better, as a kind of prophetic presence in the midst of society. Rosenzweig said, no, that's Christianity's job. That kind of engagement with history is not Jewish at all. The Jews are supposed to be outside of history and spend all of their time kind of gazing at their own eternity and praying a lot. Of course, as you know, corporeal beings, they have to work in the world and eat and earn money and so on. But when we talk about what Judaism really is, it's almost entirely otherworldly, in his view. This, you know, from one point of view is simply insane, but from another point of view, it has something appealing about it. I mean, the Jews are different, and they're very old. I don't think we can take the eternity of the Jews any more than we can take the eternity of humanity or of the biosphere for granted. I think after the Holocaust, in a nuclear age, in an age of global climate change, I don't think the certainties that feed into this sort of religious confession are kosher anymore. You can't make these affirmations.
But can we say that Rosenzweig in fact laid the foundation of religious anti-Zionism, of modern religious anti-Zionism?
No, I think Rosenzweig is too... the people who, in the Haredi, in the ultra-Orthodox world, who remain staunchly anti-Zionist, do not read Rosenzweig. They've not even heard of Rosenzweig. I'll give you an example. I mean, not even Rosenzweig, but Maimonides, the Rambam. A long time ago, when I was a camp counselor at a Jewish camp in New York State, it was like, I don't know, 40 plus years ago, one of our field trips was to this Hasidic enclave in upstate New York. And we were in this big yeshiva, so just me and the boys. And nobody spoke English in the yeshiva. They only spoke Yiddish. But there was this one Hasid from South Africa who spoke Yiddish. I spoke English. And he came up to us to sort of show us around. And I said to him, trying to sound, you know, like I knew what was going on, I said, "What are you learning?" And he said, "We're learning the Rambam." Rambam is Maimonides. I said, "What Rambam?" And he looked at me, he said, "Mishnah Torah," you know, the code that we discussed the other day. That's what you learn, right? I said, "Did you ever read the Moreh Nevuchim, the Guide for the Perplexed?" And he said, "What is it?" I said, "You've never heard of it?" He said, "No." I said, "It's the Rambam's work of philosophy." And he took one step back and he said, "The Rambam would never write a work of philosophy." So, I mean, they're not reading Rosenzweig. Where the Orthodox anti-Zionism comes from, we go till 1, right?
Unfortunately. And I would like to have like a conversation.
Oh, okay. There's a text in the Talmud that is a very imaginative interpretation of part of the Song of Songs, the Shir Hashirim. And the Talmud takes these verses as an oath, a promise, a pledge that the Jews make to God. And the oath that the Jews make, using these verses from Song of Songs, is the verses talk about, that you won't fall in love until love comes to you. You won't stir up or cause love to come about. So the Talmud's view of this is the Jews promise God that they won't rebel against the Gentile nations, that they won't go up from Galut, from the diaspora, to Israel, to the land of Israel as a group, as a wall in the text. And there's a third one, I don't remember. But the force of this, as it's been interpreted in traditional Judaism, is basically, thou shalt not work to rebuild a Jewish state. That is the prerogative of the Messiah. That's something the Messiah will do. And if you do that, you are violating the oath that you took to God. So that's what they're reacting to in their anti-Zionism. They see this as a kind of chutzpah, a kind of aggressive boldness that violates a covenant in which they made with God, not to go back and not to set up a state and all of that. So those Orthodox Jews, who are many, who reject this view, how do they do it? Because the other side of that text is that in return, the Gentiles, the Goyim, will not persecute Israel yoter midai, more than enough. I don't know what enough is, but they won't persecute Israel too much. So after the Holocaust, some, like Rabbi Soloveitchik, said the Gentiles broke their oath. And therefore the Jews are no longer bound by their oath. So that's the legitimation from a more modern Orthodox point of view for engaging in the Zionist project. And there are many shades of opinion in between that, but the basic Haredi view is that this is simply forbidden by the Torah. So the Haredim have tried to, those hundreds and hundreds of thousands of them live in Israel. They have a kind of politically ambiguous relationship to the state. On one hand, they're citizens. They benefit from the state. It gives them security. It gives them money. They don't want to serve in the army. Some of them do, but most of them don't. More secular politicians are always trying to pass legislation to draft them into the army. I think there is such legislation, but nobody wants to enforce it. It's a religion, politics kind of messy situation. But it has nothing to do with Rosenzweig. And I don't know if Rosenzweig himself knew of that text or of that tradition. But I think you're right that it does kind of have the same
logic.
Yeah, the same logic to it, and that the eternity of the Jews brings them to a place beyond the cares and struggles of history. Certainly every individual Jew has plenty of cares and struggles, but as a people, they don't want the people to be in the midst of the world. They want to be a sort of a separate world that just cultivates its own essence. And Rosenzweig would very much approve of that. That's part of the reason I don't like him. I think it's an escape from responsibility. And I think Judaism is all about taking responsibility for the world. I don't think religion should be escapist. It should be an engagement with the world in a morally responsible way. So almost out of time, but just to take a look at the very last page of this reading, the section, the eternity of the promise. Therefore, the true eternity of the eternal people must always be alien and vexing, as worrisome, unintelligible, confusing to the state, to the history of the world. In the epochs of world history, the state wields its sharp sword and carves hours of eternity in the bark of the growing tree of life, while the eternal people, untroubled and untouched, year after year adds ring upon ring to the stem of its eternal life. The power of world history breaks against this quiet life, which looks neither right nor left. Again and again, world history may claim that its newest eternity is the true eternity, but over and against all such claims, we see the calm and silent image of our existence, which forces both him who wants to see and him who does not to realize that eternity is nothing of the startlingly newest. And skipping down toward the bottom, only the eternal people, which is not encompassed by world history, can at every moment bind creation as a whole to redemption, while redemption is still to come. So the Jews have this fabulous metaphysical redemptive vocation, which they fulfill and pursue just by being themselves and living in their own liturgy. It's Christians who are engaged with the world, trying to convert it to the way of God, even if they have to make war and do politics to do so. It's a fully anti-political vision, at least as far as the Jews go. Okay.
Thank you.
You're welcome.